Hello everyone, welcome back. In this video, I wanted to go over the fourth and the fifth sources of uncertainty from the Latour book. He starts off the fourth source of uncertainty, matters of fact versus matters of concern, by saying that we need to abandon the ether of society to feed off of controversies. And I love his use of the metaphor here about ether. If you know about the history of science or physics in particular, how I think it was maybe even as far back as Aristotle who posited this idea that the universe was not empty, there's not a vacuum in space. Instead, there's this sort of mysterious substance called the ether. And that was thought necessary. There must be something like ether in existence, because otherwise, how could light travel? At least that's kind of how I understood their understanding. And of course, all this was turned on its head when Einstein came along and started talking about relativity and the fact that the speed of light is a constant, and there's all this sort of really weird stuff that starts happening as you approach light speed, or when things get really, really small at the subatomic level, or really, really big. So a lot of these earlier understandings of science, something like the ether, they were able to prove, scientists were able to prove that there really wasn't anything like this ether. This was just a false idea, I suppose. And really what Latour wants to do is the same thing, but instead of talking about ether and, in between constellations or whatever, he's talking about this word social, as it's used by sociologists to explain away all of these phenomena. And so I like where he's going with that. He also says that he wants to, now that we've spent the entirety of the book up to this point questioning the idea of the social in sociology, now we want to start questioning the logy a bit of this. And he'll get into the next chapter about even the writing of it down, even the accounts that we keep, are part of this process. There's got a lot of interesting passages throughout this uncertainty. A lot of you wrote your nuggets about these ideas, so I won't spend a lot of time on them here. He says that he didn't like he doesn't want people to be confused by when he talks about constructionism. I don't think that he's talking about social construction or deconstruction, or saying that these things are false. Instead, he says, this is on page 88, he says, just in plain English, don't you wish that more theorists would occasionally just say, in plain English, blah, blah, blah. So in plain English, to say something is constructed means that it's not a mystery that popped out of nowhere, or that it has a more humble but also more visible and more interesting origin. So it didn't come out of nowhere. It was constructed at some point and somehow. And also that it's interesting to see how it was constructed. I think this is just so key to education, especially science education. This is a little mad aside here, if you will. I think one of the main reasons why we find physics or chemistry or really any kind of science or even math so boring, at least many of us find it very boring, is that it's precisely because it is taught as just coming out of nowhere, right? We read all these, here's how it works. Here's a formula, and here's how you apply the formula, and so on and so forth. Here's how all this works, right? I mean, we don't see, how do people come up with this stuff, or what did people believe before this formula came out, or what were the experiments that led up to this conclusion? I mean, that's the part of science that's really interesting and fascinating, really, is sort of how it all came together. But when you just sort of cut to the end of the novel, it really does remind me of this. If you're into murder mysteries and you just skip to the last page, and that's the only part of the novel you read, yeah, you'd probably think murder mysteries kind of sucked. Really, it's all the stuff that comes before that that makes it worthwhile. Anyway, just a total aside, but that's one of the insights I get from reading Latour is that really, far from seeing the constructivism of science and saying, well, who cares? Why do we need to study all the wrong ideas? Why do we care about ether? That turned out to be wrong. Why do we care? Why should we teach students anything about that? Well, it's because of this, right? Seeing these science as a construction site, if you will, makes it more interesting and would probably go a long ways towards making it less boring, quite honestly. Anyway, so he talks more about construction sites here, and he says one of the nuggets, I forget who it was, maybe Berlin, maybe? Anyway, somebody was talking about their job involves construction sites, and I thought that was really serendipitous there. But certainly, you could imagine how if you go to you see all these buildings on campus. It's not really very interesting, right? They're kind of more intermediaries. You probably don't even give much thought to them. Whereas when you go to a construction site, you sort of see all the scaffolding, the materials lying around, the people out there with their tools. It's a lot more interesting to see that. And it gives you a better appreciation for this process, right? It might reveal all kinds of things. And he says, look, just take that same idea of the construction site and think of any making of process. And he gives lots of examples. Films. I love getting the Blu-ray discs or DVDs just because they often come with these commentary tracks, and you can listen to the directors, maybe even some of the actors sometimes, and they're talking about, here's this scene, and they'll give you some stories about what was going on at the time, and it really makes the whole film more interesting. I don't listen to the commentary track the first time, but if you're going back to watch it again and with that track turned on, sometimes you get a whole new appreciation for that film that way. Cooking, the same thing. What is I think probably one of the reasons why something like the Food Network is so insanely popular is that it's just kind of boring to just get the food presented to you. Here's your burger. If you know more about how that burger was made, a lot of the times that can make eating it more interesting. So anyway, I'm not telling you anything new, I'm sure. So it says, we see a thing emerging out of inexistence by adding to any existing entity its time dimension, realizing that things could be different or that things could have failed. He talks about the risky production. And, even sometimes science can fail so spectacularly that the lab literally explodes. So, yeah, that would make things a lot more interesting. So let's see. He goes on a little bit more about that he doesn't mean by constructed that it's false or that it's just fiction, that there's nothing outside of a narrative. So he rejects all that. He says, makes about as much sense as saying that babies are not born out of their mother's wombs. And the opposite of relativism is absolutism or fundamentalism. So you might not like relativism, but on the other hand, you probably don't like this absolutism more than that, right? So, of course, we want to be somewhere in between these two. Let's see what else we have there. So back to the idea of social as being this association. And from the last chapter, really wanting to make us some room there for the non-human entities. So he's not saying that science is bunk. Instead, he wants to increase the realism. And I don't know if you've been following Latour, but I saw him in the news recently, and he was he's siding with the scientists, or the scientists have come to him for help, basically, because of the climate change deniers. So I don't know if you know this. Well, I'm sure you do, but there's a lot of people out there saying that global warming or climate change is just this political thing, and there's no real science to back it up. It's just fake news, for lack of a better word. So they've actually recruited Latour to try to do something about this. And so that shows you that the scientists would go to him, shows you that, yeah, of course he's not saying science is bunk. He's actually trying to increase the realism of it. And it makes perfect sense to me why they'd want to use Latour to this end, because he is talking so much about the way science is presented, making it more interesting. All of these things, to me, I can see why they would think, well, if you want more people to buy into this notion of climate change, the science needs to be more interesting. There needs to be more actors in play, if you will. So anyway, let's give you that as another little aside. Okay, let's see. Can we move on? So he says, this is over on page 93. So Ant requires us to simultaneously abandon both the use of nature and the use of society. So for him, it's just as erroneous to talk about nature with a capital N as it is to talk about society with a capital S. So we're not going behind anything to see we're not positing this ether. On the other hand, we're not claiming to do the same thing, I guess, with nature, as though we could, sort of get at the nature of things without some kind of account. So for him, these are equally false positions. It says there, the social sociologist is an artifact caused by the same lack of relativity in the description. So every time some A is said to be related to some B, it's the social itself that is being generated. So I guess there, when you think about Einstein and his theories of relativity, it's the same sort of thing with social. Instead of saying that there's this absolute thing out there, something behind everything, we say that social gets generated every time you have this A relating to some B, right? It's all relative, I suppose. Then he talks about the sociologists and how they do the sociology of religion, and this is, I think, offensive to a lot of people, a lot of students, when they're religious, right? And they come into a sociology class, or maybe even a class like this one, and there's a theorist there trying to explain away religion as just being this social phenomenon. Of course, there's no God, really. I mean, it's all just kind of a social, it's just all social, and you see that all the time, right? And religious people, he says here, they never screamed in anger when they were being socially explained. I don't know if that's true, really, but probably less so than when they started trying to apply the same idea to science. I guess it's one thing to say that religion is just a social phenomenon. When you start saying that chemistry is just a social phenomenon, or geology or metallurgy or whatever it is, it doesn't really work that way, or it didn't seem to work out for the social sociologists. They encountered a lot of resistance. And for what Latour says is that the, I guess, sort of laypersons, or people that weren't scientists or weren't part of the academy, they didn't really have maybe they were out there saying this is ridiculous, you're completely wrong, but those aren't the voices that are going to show up in the journals, right? So to be published in the journals and for other academics to encounter these voices, it just wasn't going to happen. That wasn't represented. I think there's definitely some truth to that. On the other hand, the other scientists, those were in the journals, right? And they were saying this is all claptrap. There's no social explanation for the way these chemicals are behaving, or the mollusks, or whatever the case may be. Basically, you guys are kind of full of it. And for Latour, he says this is really where the sociologists had to back off. They had to basically say that, well, we can talk about all this other stuff, but when we're dealing with science, we have to back off, and it fails, basically. And he says it was really the first time they were studying up, right? So that the way I interpret this, I think there's a simpler way to put it, is that the sociologists before this were looking down on everybody else. You religious people, You don't really know what you're doing. Let me explain what you're doing. I'm the sociologist. I'm the expert here. When they tried to do the same thing to the chemists, the chemists were saying, hold on, this isn't going to fly with me. And, and by the way, I'm your colleague, and I can see that you don't get tenure or don't get a grant. I'm just kind of making stuff up there. But it did seem like there was a little bit of that. So anyway, what Latour says is, okay, it failed, but we shouldn't just say that, well, okay, it failed when we applied it to science, but that's science. There's something special about science that's not true of all these other fields. And what Latour says is hold on. What you should conclude is that it didn't fail when you applied it to science because there's something special about science. It's just that the theory in general is a failed theory. It's like that ether thing. And again, it kind of reminds me coming back to the need for something like relativity. If you have Newtonian physics, that seems to work for a great many problems that you encounter in the real world, right? With engineering problems, Newtonian physics, or even maybe Aristotelian physics works great. But in these cases where you're dealing with something at the speed of light, approaching the speed of light, starts to break down, right? Or at the subatomic level with the, what is it? The like electrons. Suddenly all these formulas and mechanics start to break down. You need to have another theory, and that was the relativity. So it sounds like Latour is saying something similar here, right? That instead of just saying, well, actually Newtonian physics are correct, and there's just these special cases where it doesn't work. He wants to say, well, no, the Newtonian physics just doesn't work. It's just flawed, and we need to fully embrace the relativity. And of course, maybe he would even say, yeah, sometimes this older model it is useful in some cases, but flawed. So let's see, moving on. I like this bit. So the scientists keep adding causes to explain a phenomenon where sociologists instead make the phenomena disappear with their explanation. So again, I guess we could think about ether, or you get some other examples here that I really liked about the steel desk. You had this desk made out of freaking steel, right? That seemed like a very solid material thing if there ever was one. But he says even something like that. I got the passage here somewhere. Somewhere he talks. Maybe it's in the next chapter, but he was talking about even something like that can start to break down. Could have sworn I wrote that in my notes, but if you have a metallurgist look at it, or start looking at that desk at the atomic level or something like that, you find out there's actually a lot more empty space in that desk. There's huge amounts of space in between the atoms than a solid object, I suppose. You see, I totally lost my train of thought there. Okay, so anyway, he says for him, he talks about the Rubicon here. So you think of, what was it, Caesar crossing the Rubicon and tossing the dice and everything. And sort of that point of no return for him was when scientists of various types, I suppose, began talking about microbes, scallops, and reefs. Reefs, I'm kind of familiar with the science of that. And you think about how reefs are formed, and of course there's some ecological concerns about reefs sort of disappearing, eroding, whatever. When you get down to study those, there seems to be something like something very social going on, but of course these aren't people or animals. So it was kind of like the duck-billed platypus. Suddenly we have something that seems to be blurring. It seems to be this and this. A lot of the dichotomies started to break down. Didn't seem to make sense. And for Latour, he says that was when I really felt like the concept of the social had to be altered. And let's see. Yeah, he puts the functioning of satellites in there too. You don't normally think about satellites being social, but he says they're also not non-social because they do make others do things. So the social is nowhere in particular as a thing among other things, but may circulate everywhere as a movement connecting non-social things. So all of the actors we're going to deploy might be associated in such a way that they make others do things. And so I guess that's really the key here. If something is acting, it's making something else do something. That's done not by transporting a force that will remain the same throughout as some form of faithful intermediary. That'd be a sort of reductionist or simplistic view of it. Instead, it generates transformations manifested by the many unexpected events triggered in the other mediators that follow them along the line. So when I read this, I think about the butterfly effect. I'm not sure where that idea comes from, but the idea of a butterfly somewhere flapping its wings and how that in really mysterious ways can have this, maybe that triggers a hurricane somewhere else, right? I don't know if Latour would take it to that point, but I think that's kind of in the spirit of what he's getting at here, is that things are a lot more complex than we want to think. He says this is the principle of irreduction. A concatenation of mediators does not trace the same connections and does not require the same type of explanations as a retinue of intermediaries transporting a cause. And so he wants to talk about all of these mediators, and the more of them you have, the better. Remember, the mediators, you put anything in and who knows what's going to come out. They're a lot more unpredictable. So we need many, many of those, and fewer of these intermediaries transporting a cause. And so to bring this back to creative writing, I would say this would be kind of like somebody saying your story has way too many stock characters or stereotypes in there. It's, these characters, they're very flat characters, right? And what you really need are a lot more rounded characters, right? And so I would put it that way. And so for Latour, I think he would say the sociology, we need a lot more round characters, a lot more unpredictable characters and objects and non-humans in there, and a lot less of the stock characters and the stereotypes. He says you get enough of these mediators and you don't even need this concept of ether anyway. And then he introduces the word translation on page 108. He says translation is what is traced by those translations in the scholar's accounts, a relation that does not transport causality, but induces two mediators into coexisting. So I think that's where this translation, why he uses that word translation. You think about translating, somebody speaking a different language, translating it into another language. I think it's that same sort of concept. You have these two mediators, could be people, could be anything, but they're coexisting, right? So they've been brought together somehow into this relation. And I think translation, we want to go beyond just the idea of translating a language, but I guess it is making something else do something, right? Now, there's no society, no social realm, no social ties, but there does exist these translations between mediators that may generate traceable associations. So these two mediators, there's something that happens there between those things, and whatever that is, you can see that, detect it in some way, and in other words, it's traceable somehow, and you can generate that. Now, then he talks a little bit about the matters of fact versus matters of concern. And so for him, it seems like don't worry about fact. Well, that's just a fact. I think he would say, well, it's not. If it is just a fact, then it's kind of irrelevant, right? If it's, again, coming back to this idea, I think of if there's no controversy about it, who cares, right? It's only when there's controversies that things become of concern to us, right? And then it kind of enters into this. So it kind of enters into the social. There's these. We can trace those associations again. If there's nothing like that going on, then we can't really do any work on it. Can't study it. Can't even see it. And for Latour, if you can't see it, if you can't detect it, you might as well be talking about ether. Let's see. Everywhere, the empirical multiplicity of former natural agencies overflows the narrow boundaries of matters of fact. There exists no direct relation between being real and being indisputable. So that's it. I forget again. I'm sorry. I should take notes of who wrote what nugget, but I know somebody put this in their nugget. This line: there exists no direct relation between being real and being indisputable. So when I read that, I again think about the really sort of cutting edge physics and things going on. It's kind of above my pay grade, really, but it seems to me that just sort of common sense understandings of even something like matter is really not nearly as simple as we like to think. Things actually get pretty bizarre and interesting, and where's that coming from? It's coming from the physicists, right? The theoretical physics. It's not actually making things, more like matters of fact. It's actually seeing like the more you sort of, or the better the science gets around it, the less facts, or the fewer facts we seem to glean from it, right? And really, the more bizarre and complicated things that turn out to be. Oh, there we go. There's my quote about the steel desk. So he says, you talk to a metallurgist about this desk, and they might say that, look, there's so many conundrums on the ways material resistance may occur. There's almost no relation between what the positivist philosophers and material scientists call matter. So there's all kinds of disputes. I mean, heavily disputed stuff at the, you think about what a hot topic means, right? In your Teach 191 writing class, you say you want your students to write about the hot topics. I think for Latour, really any science that's worth calling a science is going to have this level of hotness. There's going to be all this dispute, all this controversy, and that's where the science is happening. More broadly speaking, that's where whatever social things are happening. That's what the social is this controversy, all these associations and controversies. And so matters of concern. Yes, these are highly uncertain, loudly disputed. These real, objective, atypical, and above all, interesting agencies are taken not exactly as object, but rather as gatherings. So when we speak of nature, you won't think about this sort of jumping into simplicity too quick or reducing it too fast. He calls it a premature unification. Premature unification into matters of fact. So you could read that, I guess, as a tendency to jump into concluding that something is a fact versus something is a theory, or that there's a dispute about these things. It's just as wrong. I think pretty much any scientist would tell you that. It's just wrong to do that in science, just in general, and it'd be wrong for sociologists to do that same thing. So we're deploying multiple actors, different viewpoints, and so we must resist both the indifference to reality. So you don't want to just say, well, all that matters is discourse. So you don't want to go that far. So indifference to reality as well as premature unification. So we must make untenable the handy split between unity and objectivity on one side versus multiplicity and symbolic reality on the other. So again, what he was saying a couple chapters ago about the sociologists and how they would say, well, you're coming up to a stop sign on your bike. I'm a sociologist. There's some social dimensions here, symbolic communication or whatever. But the actual material composition of the sign, that's, we'll leave that to the scientist. The brakes on the bike, leave that to the engineers or whatever. So for Latour, he's saying, look, that's just as wrong to do that as it is to make the other mistake, I suppose, which would be for the scientists just to dismiss all this stuff as that's just a fact. So I think that's where we kind of leave off with that fourth controversy. So I'll stop here for a moment. What do you think of this idea of matters of fact versus matters of concern? What he's saying here about ether, relativity, the use of nature, and how scientists are using this concept of matters of fact, and how that's pretty much just as bad as the sociologists and what they're doing with the term social. So I'll just leave it here, maybe just make it a little broader. What did you think about this uncertainty? Do you agree with Latour about it? What do you make of it? Okay, then the fifth controversy, and I think this is the uncertainty that would be the most germane, really, for us as rhetoricians or people interested in writing studies, because he really is talking about the text and the writing all this down, and how do you create a report, or how do you present your findings, if you will. And so I love this line on page 122. This is not sociology anymore, but slow-cheology. Slow-cheologist. I'd love to be a slow-cheologist. I like the sound of that. The solution to relativism is always more relativity. And for Latour, and he's made this point before, that you don't want to think about the report as being the culmination and the end. The study really never ends, and furthermore, the study itself sort of plays back in to the assembly. It's kind of an active thing. The report, it's not like you're outside of the situation having no impact. Instead, at least if it's a good study, it's going to have impact. It's going to sort of become enmeshed in the very sort of entanglements that you set out to study. So you can't really disentangle yourself or your report from what it is you're studying. So I like that idea. Let's see. So we enter in media res. Action's already started. It will continue when we will no longer be around. I don't know how many of you are familiar with Kenneth Burke, but this strongly reminded me, this bit on 123, of Kenneth Burke and his parlor. Burke talks about, I guess, journal publications, the academic conversation, and uses this metaphor of a parlor, and you show up as a student and you're sort of listening to all these conversations around you. Eventually you join in the conversation. Eventually you leave, but the conversation continues. It's sort of always continued. And so it sounds like that's something similar here. The text itself is a mediator. Oh, there we go. Good sociology has to be well written. If not, the social doesn't appear through it. So the text itself is kind of, again, part of the process. You can't just cut it out. It actually enters in, or it's sort of itself social, I suppose. He says, it's making connections. And he says, we don't want to think about we want objectivity, but not in the sense of being cold or boring or just matters of fact, but instead warm, interested, controversial building sites of matters of concern. They must convoke actors recalcitrant enough to interfere with the bad writing. So again, I don't know if you I like all these references to creative writing or not, but this bit about actors recalcitrant enough to interfere with the bad writing, it again reminds me so much of what I hear creative writers say about their characters. And I was reading John Gardner's Craft of Fiction. I think it's called The Craft of Fiction. And Gardner in there at one point says that sometimes these authors have sort of political agendas, or they've got their own sense of right and wrong, and they try to convey this. They want their novel to kind of have a moral, and people to walk away with certain political views or whatever. But what happens is they put these characters in there, and so these characters kind of take over, and they become much more interesting. Who was it? Milton and the devil, or Satan, or whatever it is. And sometimes these villainous characters can end up totally disagreeing, or sort of bringing the whole process, knocking it all askew. Or think about a novel, maybe some kind of person that thought slavery was fine, but they put these slave characters in their play or their story, and even sort of against their will, these slave characters kind of resist these notions, right? So even though it's a badly written story in a sense, it's a bad, the writer set off with these bad intentions. Nevertheless, it's kind of a good writing, I suppose, because the actors, they're kind of stubborn, right? They don't fall into place. They don't obey. They kind of resist this, and you could walk away with a totally different moral, if you will, than maybe what that writer intended. So anyway, sorry, that's a bit of a long aside there, but that's what I'm getting out of this is, and when a sociologist sits down to write a report, who knows, maybe the sociologist has this big political agenda, whatever that is, but if they do their job, if they write something well, then that doesn't really matter so much, because they're just one part of this process. And if they got the actors in there, and they're reigniting or sparking all of these associations, then you might, again, they can sort of almost speak out against the will of that writer. So let's see. We're not only writing fiction. However, says, look, the hard work of the fiction writers. Then again, I think, sometimes I don't think we can get at the truth, whatever that means, except via fiction. I know a lot of you would agree with that. That's why we have literature, right? You don't just read literature for entertainment purposes. And a lot of times these works, and again, I think maybe because of some of these problems that Latour is pointing out here, hey, I wanted these characters to do this, but they seem to have a life of their own, and they're doing this other thing. Maybe the fact that there is that sort of controversy and resistance is where it's why the fiction matters, right? And how it can be truer in some sense than a quote unquote objective, dry, boring kind of account. And he said, I love this passage on 127. Textual accounts are the social scientist's laboratory. It's just great. And if laboratory practice is any guide, it's because of the artificial nature of the place that objectivity might be achieved on conditions that artifacts be detected by a continuous and obsessive attention. That could make a great motto, I think, for writers. Even if you're a novelist, I think you could do worse than that. Textual accounts can fail like experiments often do. So I love this idea too, that can you really say that experiment was that was such a successful experiment or study, even though the textual account of it was a horrible failure? These are very interlinked. Either one can fail, or they both could fail. Now, the textual account itself extends the exploration of the social connections a little bit further. So again, it's part of this imbroglio that he keeps talking about. The good account traces the network, string of actions where each participant is treated as a full-blown mediator. All the actors do something and don't just sit there. And again, I think if you read these creative writing books, they're always telling you this, right? Can you go back through the story and find a scene that you could just cut out because it really doesn't mean anything and doesn't do anything? It's just sort of taking up space. Do you have a character that doesn't ever do anything, doesn't act? Then you could probably cut it out. Same thing in these reports, right? All the actors do something. Nothing's just sitting there. It's the social, this circulating entity. It's not this stale, dead thing, but it's a living thing. And every time you read the report, that's sort of bringing it to life. The good text elicits networks of actors when it allows the writer to trace a set of relations defined, again, as so many translations. So these mediators translating. And then he talks about his network, and as you recall, the ANT stands for Actor Network Theory. And he said at the start of the book he doesn't like any of these terms, but I guess they'll work. But he says network is really troubling because we tend to think about it as just something that's out there. So the network, we kind of want to visualize it as a real thing. And he keeps saying here, look, don't do that. Don't think about it like a real network, like the electrical network with all these wires and things you can go out and see, objects. He says, don't think about it. That's not how he's using network. He says it's a tool. This is a tool like the perspective grids for perspective painting. So, if you've taken drawing classes, you know about the what they call the viewfinders. So you have these little boxes with measurements on them, and you sort of frame what it is you're drawing, and you use the lines along the sides there to help you to draw that out, put things in their proper place at the right angles to achieve that kind of perspective. And I guess some artists, if you look at some of the drafts of famous paintings and so on, you might see where they've actually drawn in these lines to help them achieve the perspective, but of course they erase those things out of it later. So it says the same kind of thing with this network in ANT. It's not a thing out there. It's just sort of this tool, this viewfinder kind of thing. You put the lines there to help you, but they're not there in the real world, right? And he says he would really like to use the word work net or action net instead, but he doesn't like jargon, so he's not going to do that. So what's the key is that it designates flows of translation. So these mediators and their associations and their translating. He says there's three components to it. The point-to-point connection is being established, which is physically traceable and thus can be recorded empirically. So if you can't do this, if you're just saying there's this, these two things have a connection, but you know what, I can't detect it in any way, I can't show it, it's not out there, it's not something I can point at in any way. Well, for him, then it's irrelevant. It doesn't even, it's like that ether again. It has to be physically traceable. He says, B, such a connection leaves empty most of what is not connected. And he says, think about a fish net. And of course, there's a lot more holes in the net than there is rope. And then finally, the connection is not made for free, requires effort. So there's some kind of energy that's sustaining these connections. He talks about the fisher out there throwing the net, I suppose. You could use that. So we should no more believe the world is made of social groups, societies, and cultures than we should that the world is made of points and lines. All right. So how do you actually do this work? Kind of an important question, wouldn't you say? And I will point here to Laura Grease. And I know I've mentioned her book before. I don't see it here handy. I would show it to you, but anyway, she wrote a book about oh, come on. Anyway, it was about the Obama Hope image, and it won a bunch of awards in composition. And her method for studying the Obama image, or really just any kind of, if you want to talk about visual rhetoric, I suppose, she tries to adapt Latour's methods here with these notebooks. She doesn't use literal notebooks. She's got spreadsheets and things she uses instead, but it's the same sort of principle. So anyway, if you want to do this work, Latour says you need 4 different notebooks. One is a log of the inquiry itself, so you always want to be tracking what it is you're doing from day to day. And Grease talks about web links. If you want to type different words into Google, different terms to do your searches, and sort of what connects to what, you're kind of keeping track of all that. Notebook 2, record of items in chronological order and the start of a categorizing system to be evolved later. And this needs to be a loose system. So when Grease was studying the Obama Hope image, she found all of these websites that had that image on them in many, many different contexts. I mean, it's really a great book. Just so you can sort of get a feel for, wow, there were, you think about what kind of website might have the Obama Hope image on it, but whatever you come up with probably doesn't include all of the diversity. And it can be kind of overwhelming, right? It's just, you might not be able to see any sense of how these things can be connected, right? So that's why I emphasize this here. Don't try to fix the categories too soon. Don't be jumping to conclusions, or try to stay. I just call it stay loose. Try to keep an open mind, especially with these first few stages. 3 talks about the writing trials or the ad libs. The unique adequacy one should strive for in deploying complex imbroglios cannot be obtained without continuous sketches and drafts. So, at the end of this, if you produce this boring account that doesn't activate any of the controversies, it fails, right? And the whole thing is just a big failure. So it's going to be hard to get there. He talks about continuous sketches and drafts. For me, this might go even beyond, into realms like maybe this should be more poetic, this part, or maybe this should literally be some type of artwork here. I don't really know what it would take. We just know that it is going to be difficult, right? We have to bring some I would just say we need to bring some creativity into it. 4th, a register of the effects of the written accounts on the actors whose world has been either deployed or unified. He talks about this being a whole second experiment. So if you're describing these people, whoever they are, or whatever this thing is you're studying, again, you don't want to occupy this remote position of an observer, and you're just a neutral observer. Instead, you want to go back into the association again, or into the assemblage, and say, hey, here's, read what I've written here. What do you think about this? And again, it's not just for criticism. Well, that was well written. It's not going that, but instead, he calls this a negotiation. Deciding what are the ingredients out of which that common world might be made or not. So I guess in a way, it's not a matter. I'm going into this village for a while. I'm coming out of the village. I write my account. It's sort of you're sort of there. You're writing. You're showing your account to people. You're getting feedback, and you're coming out and you're sort of trying to form, I guess, one of these complex imbroglios. That's what you're really getting at there. It's not. And here's in a nice, tidy little package my year in, with this tribe, right? It's more about this really complex assemblage that you're building, and you are building part of it. I mean, you're part of the assemblage, I guess, is really the key. He says we're not after grandeur. Not, maybe we're not great writers or poets or artists, but he says, really, though, we're still, that said, we're struggling to invent devious and artificial ways to be true to the specific phenomenon on which we wish to get a handle on. He talks about scientists here, And so many times in science, there was something that was a theory posited, but how do you test the theory? And it took some just ingenious, very clever experiments that had to be set up and conducted, and then the scientists had to persuade other scientists this experiment was valid, right? And there's pretty ingenious experiments out there to prove things. And he talks about devious and artificial ways to do it. So just as a scientist, maybe has to get very creative and innovative, setting up an experiment. The sociologists sitting down to write also have, in their own way, cleverness in ways that they talk about things or write about things. They have to evoke or convoke, again, these actors, and it's going to take some doing. So we have to deploy the actors as networks of mediations. He says a good text, and this is, I think, just a crucial passage over on page 136, which says that the good text is never an unmediated portrait of what it describes, nor for that matter is a portrait. So I'm sure most of you probably accepted that without even giving much. Maybe that statement's almost an intermediary for you. But I want you to think a little bit about how maybe it's for at least a sociologist of the conventional type that Latour talks about, or a scientist might say that, this is an objective report. There's no, I'm just conveying the facts here. This is a fact-based report. There's no mediation going on here. This is a neutral account. You could imagine somebody saying something like that. So even this statement would be controversial for them. Maybe not so much for us. We're kind of used to this idea. So the simple act of recording anything on paper is already an immense transformation that requires as much skill and just as much artifice as painting a landscape or setting up some elaborate biochemical reaction. So no, for us, we're just saying, amen, hallelujah, great, totally agree, because we're kind of coming at it from this position already. But again, think about maybe what the scientist Latour's talking to here might object. So not thinking about explanations and descriptions as being separate things, but really kind of enmeshed. And I got to say, I don't understand this metaphor that he uses. He says, much like safe sex, sticking to description protects against the transmission of explanations. Well, over my head there. Not sure what he's getting at, to be honest. This makes more sense. So a good text should trigger in a good reader this reaction. Please, more details. I want more details. God is in the details, and so is everything else, including the devil. So, again and again, I keep coming back to creative writers. But man, how many times do you hear that? Really, any kind of writing. And you see the student, maybe in your 191 class, you get an essay, so-called argument paperback, and just all these generalizations in there, all these explanations, and you're like, well, how did you, make that leap? Or, man, this is so vague, this passage. Can you put some details in there? And every time when they go in and add those specific concrete details, all the other stuff gets better too, right? And so it's not like you have to have one or the other. They actually work. You need both. They work together. Okay, so to wrap this up, he talks about deployment here. So the good report increases the number of actors, range of agencies, number of objects, and stabilizing groups. I think about the successful television shows that everybody talks about these days. Game of Thrones comes to mind. You think about all the characters, and they're not just stereotypes in there. They're really complex characters, and you never really know who's going to do what's going to happen next. And it's hard to point at a character in that and say, well, that character has no impact or no agency. Instead, they're always finding really clever, devious ways to affect that assemblage, right? The good account will perform the social and the precise sense. Let me emphasize here. My voice is kind of giving out, sorry, but The good account will perform the social. And so I think this is really the crux to the whole book, or the whole Latour's whole theory of ant work or ant, is that social is performed, right? It's something that's happening, and it's either happening or it's not social. So it's again sort of that play. The play is either being staged at the moment, or in a sense, it's not really. That play does not really exist. What is the play? The play is, you're there, it's happening. The actors, they're reading their lines. There's this ongoing production. That's the play. After it's over, and you're just looking at a script, that's not really the play anymore. Even if it's a videotape, even if it's a recording, that's not really the play either, right? That's a recording of the play, maybe, but that's not the play. So I think in some sense that's what he's saying about the social. All right, it's got to be performed in media res, right? It's either being performed or it's not. You can't have both. So the good account, or I guess he would say, if it's not being performed, then it's a bad account. So the good account will perform the social in the precise sense that some of the participants in the action, through the controversial agency of the author. So again, we talked about this. These characters might get away from you, right? It's controversial. Will be assembled in such a way that they can be collected together. So assembled in such a way that they can be collected together. The fact is that no one has the answers. So it's not as though the actors or the characters or whatever, it's not like they have the answers. And it's also not like the author or the analyst or the sociologist or the scientist, whatever, not like they have the answers either. Instead, they have to be collectively staged, stabilized, and revised. And this is the part for Latour why you want to be a social scientist, right? Who even cares about this? It's precisely for this reason, right? That it's got to be collectively staged, stabilized, and revised, and that's why the social sciences are indispensable. It's really their reason to be. It's because they reassemble the social. He says, and I love this passage too. It is. You can be cynical, I think, about academic writing, and you might be working on a thesis or some kind of conference presentation, and it is certainly true. A lot of people do all this work. They do these enormous studies. It can take years, sometimes even decades, to do this work and to write it all up and to go through all of jump through all the hoops. And I think he says at some point, maybe you're the chair of your dissertation or the chair of the thesis actually read the damn thing. I'll be honest, a lot of times, I read everything, but I can tell you this, the stuff doesn't always get read, or at least doesn't always get read carefully, shall we say. But I'm pretty sure with my dissertation that the only person that actually read it was my outside. We had an outside chair, somebody from another department that was required to be there at the defense. The reason I say that is because he's the only one that had questions that, you can sort of tell by the questions that somebody asks that they did actually read it, because they're kind of specific questions and they're things that you didn't necessarily think about, or they're just really good questions. And he had multiple questions along those lines. Whereas the other ones, it seemed to me, could have been questions about just sort of standard dissertation or questions, right? And I'm kind of going on a little bit too long there. But anyway, don't get discouraged by that. Because on the other hand, these texts that we do or read, Latour for that matter, do change a lot of things. He talks about feminism. Man, think about the impact that feminist studies has had. It's enormous. Maybe not enough, obviously, but I don't think anybody could say they've made no difference. Yeah, it's academic text. Sure, Not many people would read, say, Judith Butler. Just general people, just lay people. There's probably not a lot of just lay people that have read Judith Butler, for example. But to say that she's had no impact, I think is just absurd, right? So all these, it's not like they make no impact. And this is, I think, comforting to think about, right? And I also like to think, too, about the mysterious connections. So, yeah, with a dissertation that maybe for all I know, that outside reader that read it, and who knows, maybe the other people did too, but maybe he was able to, maybe he brought it up in some of his other classes. Maybe maybe it changed his thought. And I think he was a biologist. So who knows what kind of butterfly effect that might have had. There's a lot of mystery, I think, to this, and unexpected conclusions when we start thinking about texts as mediators instead of intermediate. I think I'll use this. Maybe I'll put this question next time I have a thesis defense. Say, in what ways is your thesis a mediator instead of an intermediary? And you could say, well, if it was just an intermediary, then I'd just be doing this to, check a few boxes. So just a hoop I can jump through so I can move on to the next level. If it's a mediator, though, it's going to do all these things we've been talking about here. It's going to bring these different entities, humans and non-humans, together into these really interesting associations, and there will be the social happening. All right, anyway, I felt like I got a little silly here, so apologies for that, but it's Latour. I mean, he gets a little silly too, right? Just the end here on this quotation on page 140. So it says, we, the little ants, should not settle for heaven or hell, as there are plenty of things on this earth. Should be to munch. What the heck? As there are plenty of things on this earth to munch our way through. Okay, so anyway, so this passage this uncertainty was specifically about textual accounts. I think you probably have a lot to say about it, being someone who studies writing and rhetoric, right? So I want to ask sort of a two-pronged question. One is, what do you think of what do you make of his concepts? Sort of, how do you understand what he's saying here about these textual accounts, good writing and bad writing, and then how might you apply some of this in the form of writing pedagogy, right? As somebody who teaches writing, how might you implement some of these concepts? Or conversely, why might you not want to do that? Either way, I'd love to hear your thoughts on it. So anyway, I'm going to stop it here. Hope you enjoyed this and have a great day.